We're going to talk today about elevation, a very different topic, and so the background is suited for that rather than a large oak tree. I won't go into too much more detail about our background, but I'll just cover a little bit of it for anyone who's new. Peter, my brother, and Michael Tarian, our winemaker, started Obsidian Wine Company about 20 years ago. We've been making wine since we made 98 cases of Obsidian Ridge in 2002. But the story really started probably with our father, who left Hungary in 1956, escaped across the border with my mother, and ended up in California. And through a set of circumstances, met the Pepe brothers of Robert Pepe Winery, and started growing grapes in Napa Valley. And his first vineyard he planted was the Obsidian Vineyard, which is the Pinot and Chardonnay vineyard we have in Carneros. My father was trying to just make ends meet. He was just trying to put food on the table. That's called an entrepreneur these days, but he had a real spirit about him and an energy about him, and he planted in a region that nobody thought it was possible to plant in. My brother and I went to Hungary in the early 90s and found an old abandoned cooperage that had been making some barrels still for the Hungarian and local wine industry, but had lost all its export market. So we started bringing in those markets, barrels into Napa and Sonoma, and 20 years later, we sell about 5,000 barrels worldwide. So coopering has been now in our family for about 25 years. And then my brother and I had a harebrained idea. My father told us, or our father told us, whatever you do, don't make wine. We had a harebrained idea to combine those two things and make some wine. And we partnered with Michael Tarian 20 years ago to start Obsidian Wine Company. So that's our story. We've been farming for 45 years, coopering for 25 years, and making wine for almost 20. In the course of this, we found all sorts of really neat regions, and one of them is at Elevation. That was Obsidian Ridge. It's an old abandoned walnut orchard. We decided might as well try planting here, and we did. Just to put it into perspective, less than 3% of all vineyards in the world are over 1,000 feet. So I'm going to repeat that: less than 3% of all vineyards in the entire world are over 1,000 feet. So you're talking about really rare air. Sorry, excuse the pun. There's not that many vineyards up there. Obsidian Ridge is at almost 3,000 feet. So, 3 times as high as that. And what we learned over the years was that elevation makes just an enormous difference. It makes a huge difference for our farming, obviously viticulture, for the quality of the wines, really everything about it. And so what we've learned there is that you can't farm it like you farm the valley floors. And we learned, sometimes the easy way, sometimes the hard way. This presentation is a little more technical than last week. So last week we talked about oak, saw some pretty pictures of the forests in Tokai. This week you'll see a few more graphs, but they're interesting. So stick with us. And at the end is the payoff. Really, the end is when you'll understand why it is that elevation makes such an enormous difference for quality of wine. I know we stand between you and your Memorial Day weekend, so we appreciate the time this morning. And with that, one more thing, any questions, just throw them in the chat box and we will cover them after Peter tells you a little bit more about elevation. And with that, I'll hand it off to my older brother.
Good morning, Florida. It's good to see you guys, and thanks for having us on again. So this is Toto, we're not in Kansas moment. It's all derives from a Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore moment that we had at the top of the vineyard about 5 years in. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of discussion about deficit irrigation and vertical shoot positioning and opening up the canopy and getting lots of sunlight into the vines. And we did that in a very young vineyard on a pile of rocks at almost 3,000 feet. And it basically kicked our butt more than once. And we started to really rethink how we were looking at this vineyard and farming it. And this began a series of discussions with a lot of mountain winemakers in California, but then we stretched out and started talking with the Europeans and Argentinians. And ended up, actually, we founded the Elevation of Wine, which were 2 international symposia in 2007 and 2010. So this presentation is kind of an amalgamation of a series of conversations with people and also some research. And then I'll start it out. Elise, could you let me share the screen, please? Thanks. This is a series of observations, and I want to be careful here. There's not been a lot of research about this. As my brother said, since 97% of the vineyards basically at sea level or near, we have very little formal funded research on this subject. So these are graphs and results from in-house trials. And let me see if it's coming up. There we go. In-house trials at wineries. Can you guys see that? Okay, there we go. So this is a series of conversations, basically, and some field trials and winery trials, some formal research by the Europeans because it was funded by the EU. So these are the things we'll talk about today: mountain soils, mountain climate, sunlight and elevation, and climate at elevation. What's the actual local effect of UV on wine grapes? And then what I call the ripening curve. And I want to just start out by saying these effects don't just start at a single elevation, like suddenly you're at 2,000 feet and you're at elevation. These are progressive as you move up. So I'm sure you guys represent a lot of wineries that have areas that, even if they're not very high, they replicate mountain viticulture, and I'll tell you why that is. Or, you know, if you have Argentinian wines in your book, most of this will apply. I'm going to start out. So Greg Jones is one of the main guys who put a lot of this together. He's on the International Climate Change Panel. He's a brilliant climatologist, and his family grows grapes in Eugene. He's the president of Linfield College. Roberto de la Mota, we work with him. His company also represents our barrels in Argentina. Roberto's father was like the Andre Chilachev of Argentina, and Roberto has followed in his footsteps. He's an incredibly knowledgeable guy. And then one of my favorite winemakers, Ernesto Baida from Catena Zapata. Ernesto is a great guy and actually taught me a very cool wood grilled eggplant salad recipe. So that's for a different day. And then finally, the CERVIN, which is the International Center of International Mountain Viticulture, viticulture, the mountains. I just want to show this, by the way. They call it viticultura heroica, which means heroic viticulture, because some of those guys in Switzerland are like at 6,000 feet, and if it isn't that the hail that pelts them, it's their local neighbors that steal all the grapes. So anyway, we'll get into that later on. So let's talk about what is high elevation. There's really no definition. Argentina obviously comes to mind. A lot of vineyards there at 5,000 feet. But you can talk about the differences, for example, even within the West Coast. There's a lot of difference between Carneros and Amador County, or in our case, Alto Mayacamas. And I'm just showing you some examples of what people consider. I mean, Virginia has some at 1,700 feet. Oregon has some close to 2,000. Colorado, obviously, at over 6,000 feet. Argentina can be up to 8,000 feet. You guys know about New Mexico. So there are a lot of spots, but not a lot of acreage dedicated to high elevation. Central Otago, 1,400 feet. This is a really interesting example of where it's not that high, but because it's surrounded by mountains, it has much more of a mountain influence. And then, of course, we get into California, Douro, and Switzerland. So this is just a smattering of what we would consider elevation vineyards. So what kind of factors determine the way these grapes grow? One of them is, of course, the soils. There are no such things as mountain soils, really, consistently. There are as many different soils as you would find in vineyards all around. Volcanic, obviously, one of the Mayacamas mountains, but Chile has tons of it. Etna is a great example. Igneous, the California foothills, has a lot of decomposed granite. But you can also have river soils such as Mendoza. A lot of Mendoza grapes are grown on rocky, eroded river soils. So that's not really a big factor or a unique factor in elevation vineyards. But climate definitely is. So I'm going to get into this. Work with me here. There's a lot of technical aspects of this, but I'm going to try to bring it all in together at the end. First of all, we have the effects of elevation, how high you are, the terrain around you, what's called lapse rate, the slope of your vineyard and the aspect, what direction it's facing, and of course, the humidity at elevation. So let's talk about what makes weather generally. Continentality, are you close to the coast? Are you up in the mountains? Altitude, how high are you? Latitude, obviously the difference between being in British Columbia at 3,000 feet or being in the Amador foothills at 3,000 feet. Topography, that's a much more local thing. And those are the main sort of big ones. And the way they do it is modification of airflow. This is simple. Basically, mountains block wind. Also, you have local weather. For example, anybody who's been caught in a thunderstorm in the hills, in the mountains, that's a local weather pattern that happens probably every afternoon. And slope and aspect variations, these are things that are much, much more small scale. Even in Obsidian Ridge, we find differences between the top and bottom of the vineyard, and it's only about 400 feet difference. So these are going from large scale to small scale differences that you can see in vineyards throughout mountain or elevated sites. Let's dive into those a little bit. So topographical influence, this is a simple word for like the hill blocks the wind. We have diurnal winds. For example, you have warm air that rises in the afternoons. You have cold air that pushes down off the hills at night. You have inversions where you have warm air trapped by cold air above it, which is called the thermal layer. We have a big inversion at Obsidian Ridge. It has a big difference in how the top and the bottom of the vineyard ripen, for example. So it has to do with, you have isolation of terrain, that's basically pockets. Do you have a cold air source? So for example, that picture in Otago in New Zealand, there's cold air coming down from high mountains around it, even though that vineyard is only at 1,400 feet. Those are some examples. So let's talk about the difference between elevation and relief. Relative relief, I'm going to get to the graphic. Absolute relief is basically your height above sea level. Relative relief is how high you are compared to a mountain or a valley or other geographic feature near you. Both of those things will have a lot of influence. Relative relief, however, is the most. It's the difference between the high and low points right around that vineyard. That will directly affect much more of the climate than necessarily the absolute amount of elevation. However, if you get to very high elevation, such as those ridiculous vineyards in Salta, Argentina, which are like at 8,500 feet, then obviously the absolute elevation has a huge effect. That is such the extreme of elevation that basically you should be wearing crampons to harvest some of that vineyard. But those are some of the things. So I want to be clear here. Total elevation doesn't necessarily make the biggest difference. And that's an important thing. So higher, shortly saying higher is not necessarily better. So let's talk about very small local relief and topographical influences. The biggest kind of concept to think about is what they call lapse rate. And basically the lapse rate is that every 1,000 feet you go up, it gets 4 degrees cooler, right? And you guys know this. I mean, if you've gone camping at 3,000 or 4,000 feet, as soon as the sun goes down the ridge, it's cold. And even as you drive up a hillside, you can tell the top and the bottom. I mean, Hawaii is a great example of that. When you go up the big volcano, it's hot and humid down below and you're freezing at the top. That would be a really extreme example of lapse rate. Another interesting way of thinking about this is that every 1,000 feet you go up, it's essentially basically the same as going 300 miles to your pole. So of course the North Pole for us in the North Hemisphere, or the South Pole in Latin America. But, and this is the big but, this is a very theoretical number. It's really modified by the slope, the aspect of your vineyard, various local diurnal characteristics, how far you are from the coast, et cetera, et cetera. And it also varies, this lapse rate, by latitude, by season, and by the humidity in the air. So use the lapse rate as a really good starting point. but let me give you an example of how profound this effect can be. This is the West Coast, obviously. The green dot at the bottom is Obsidian Ridge. At 2,500 feet to 3,000 feet, we are essentially 700 miles north in terms of climate. That puts us right at the British Columbia border with Washington. Now, it's not that simple, but I will tell you that a lot of our physiology in the vineyard, when the buds come out, the peak sunlight season in the middle of the year, and how the harvest plays out and the ripening, is a lot more like Walla Walla than it is like Napa Valley and Alexander Valley. And by the way, Alexander Valley is about 8 miles from us as the crow flies. The north end of Calistoga is about 20. So lapse rate has a really big effect. I mean, it's a really great way of thinking about what the hell is going on when you go up into a mountain. But then let's get into what really happens locally. So the slope of your vineyard and the direction it is, whether it's south or north, east or west, has the biggest effect on heat loading of your vineyard, both for the soil and for the air. And this is a great example. So satellite technology has allowed us to really look at very fine detail of certain areas. This is a part of the North Coast. This is pretty simple. All the red is south facing, all the blue is north facing, and all the rest of it in between is some aspect of that. But what this shows is, even at a certain elevation overall, where you actually plant your vineyard in terms of the slope and the aspect has probably a bigger influence. And we know this, like right in Northern Europe, almost all the vineyards are southern facing historically since Roman times, because they knew that the north facing would never ripen, the south does. California is a little bit different. We actually really love the north facing part of Obsidian Ridge because it isn't quite as warm. This is not a super complicated graph when you look at it. This is the difference between the same area of a south facing vineyard in terms of heat summation and a north facing vineyard. And in fact, the steeper it gets, the colder it gets. And the steeper it gets, the warmer it gets. So basically this is just a nice graph for what this is showing you on the left. So what does that mean for the North Coast? I'm going to use Obsidian Ridge as a case study. It's the vineyard we know best, and we've done a lot of trials on it. And the one you guys are familiar with, this is Mount Canocti in the background. It's a slope being between 5 to 20 degree slope. It faces due north. Mount Canocti is exactly north of the vineyard. Literally, we're 1 or 2 degrees off of north. This is our dad during harvest last year. You can get a sense of the slope here. It's not pronounced, but it's there. This is a half-mile block at the very top. It's almost 20 degree slopes there. A picture you probably don't see very often is snow. We get it 2-3 times a year. And in 2008, it was enough for us to ski down it. So these are some examples of being not very far from Alexander Valley, but they don't ski their vineyards in Alexander Valley. And that shows how really profoundly different you can go. This is what lapse rate is about. Here's another chart that we've been working on. Greg Jones has worked a lot on climate change. This is a data set of temperature for the last 50 years. And basically, blue is getting colder and red is getting warmer. And the difference here is, as the Central Valley heats up here to the right, it's drawing cold air from the ocean deeper into the inland, especially across the ridges. However, this cold air cannot go down into the valleys. This is Alexander Valley and Dry Creek in Healdsburg. This is Napa Valley. This is Sonoma Valley. These are getting progressively warmer. None of us are happy about this situation, obviously, but it is interesting how the effects are different. And Obsidian Ridge is in fact looks like possibly even cooler. The way we measure this is called growing degree days. Growing degree days is the net cumulative amount of temperature above 50 degrees in any given summer growing season. And I'm going to show you 2 of them. This is a fairly warm area, and this is a cooler area. The warmer area starts out earlier in the season, and you get budding out a month before. This is the difference between March and April, as you can see those two lines. But during the middle of the year, the temperature is almost exactly the same. So if you were to walk out in one region versus another region, it is basically the same temperature in July and August. But when you get into harvest, look at that difference. Suddenly it starts cooling off quite a bit earlier in the cool region than the warm region. And you can have a long, slower tail in how you pick your grapes. The two regions here are Bordeaux and Oakville in Napa, right? So this is a really, you guys are familiar obviously with both regions and the style of wines. But what surprises most people is actually during the middle of the year, it's almost exactly the same temperature. It's the shoulder seasons that are important in elevation vineyards or cool sites. And Bordeaux is not elevated, but it's cool because it's near the ocean. So this is the North Coast. Looking at growing degree days, I know there's a lot of data there, but it basically goes from Sonoma Coast as the coolest area to Dunnigan Hills as the warmest. Red Hills is here right above with Stag's Leap District. But again, look at the texture of the North Coast. There's a lot of areas that are quite warm, super hot, the Central Valley, areas that are cooler, and a lot of areas that are much more complex than that. And this is an overlay of all the sub-appellations of the North Coast. So again, I'm just trying to give you guys a sense of how varied temperature and growing conditions can be, even in a relatively compact area such as the North Coast. I'll skip that and I'll get back. This is another way of looking at that same graph, right? So mountains generally, I mean, here's a great example. Here are Spring and Diamond Mountains, same effect. They're getting cooler because the cold air at 3,000 feet is getting pulled across them, and it's basically raking the heat off the vineyards in the afternoon. So then that's climate, that's temperature. Obviously we think about that, but let's talk about sunlight. So the most interesting thing is luminosity, and luminosity is different than heat. Obviously, luminosity is more UV. Rarefaction is the technical term for it. But basically, every 1,000 feet you go up, you get 3 to 4% more ultraviolet light. So that means at our vineyard, we have 10% more UV every single day as soon as the sun comes up and as long as the sun drops down. That adds up. Any of you who've been up to Obsidian Ridge, but if you forget your hat in Carneros, it's no big deal. If you walk around all day without your hat on, you can get pretty sunburned and sun-slapped up Obsidian Ridge. So the skins have that same experience. The seed basically wants, the grape wants to protect its offspring, which is the seed. So the reaction of wine grapes is to build thicker skins. And as a result, to block the UV. And as a result, we have much higher levels of anthocyanins, polyphenols, and resveratrol. Anthocyanins being primarily the color in wine, polyphenols being all the things that we smell and taste. You also tend to get higher levels of seed tannin, but lower levels of bitter monomeric tannins. The reason is because the UV does penetrate through the skin, and it starts to break down those sort of bitter seed tannins earlier in the season because there's just more UV. This is the same effect on pyrazines. Pyrazines are that green bell pepper character. The research shows the amount of sunlight you get into the seed between seed formation and actually veraison, which is when it turns color, determines pyrazines. Pyrazines don't work very well at high concentrations, so high elevation vineyards kind of take care of that without having to open canopy just because the UV is there. And finally, because it's in mountains, I just want to show this picture. The clusters tend to be much smaller and the berries are smaller. So there's a lot more space around, open space around the cluster and the berries so that the light can kind of penetrate in there. These are not these sort of large football Cabernet clusters that you would find sometimes in other vineyards where all the berries are super packed in. Big effect on making sure that you don't have a lot of those green harsh characters that Cabernet can sometimes have. Final, humidity. You guys know humidity in Florida. I don't have to tell you what that's like, right? It's beautiful. when the sun finally stops, you can sit outside till 2 in the morning in an outside bar and just be comfortable in a shirt, right? Because of the humidity. So humidity is essentially an insulative blanket that covers the earth. As you get up higher, that humidity drops off. Cold, clean mountain air, you know, it's the whole different deal. So there's not a lot of sitting outside at 6,000 feet all night until 2 in the morning, but in your shirt. But that's what happens in vineyards as well. So, for example, just to give you guys, we have a humidity monitor at Poseidon and humidity monitor at Obsidian. It is half the humidity almost all the time. We are low humidity in Napa, so it's 30–40% humidity. It's 15% at Obsidian Ridge. What does this mean? Essentially, when the sun drops behind the ridge, the heat can then radiate off the mountain really quickly. And the soil temperature and the air temperature drops pretty dramatically because there's nothing to keep it down like a blanket of humidity. This is what we call a diurnal swing. Diurnal swings have a lot of effect on how grapes mature. So it really works. The Argentinians have found it's really important for creating color, that big switch of 40 to 50 degrees a day. They actually, Roberto de la Mota believes that's a bigger aspect or impact for color than overall elevation. And we keep better acidity. Essentially, acidity breaks down in grapes under 50 degrees, right? It's basically like sticking your fruit into the fridge. It's just not, it's going to last another 2 weeks. This is the same thing. So essentially in Obsidian Ridge and other high elevation vineyards, every time at night, it gets below 50 degrees. And let me show you how much. This is a whole season last year, 2019, which was amazing vintage for us. We were very, very happy with this. It was probably our most even, and it's just great pick all the way through. But anyway, as you can see, first of all, one thing I want to show you, we barely hit 100 degrees once last year. So the high temperatures never get very high. Why is that? I mean, there's plenty of sunlight. It's pretty close to Napa and Sonoma. They deal with 100-degree days all the time, or high 90s. I mean, we don't even have that many high 90 days. Well, the night times are cold. Even in the middle of summer, the temperature of the vineyard gets down to 60 degrees, maybe even 50 in some cases. But by the end of the year, look at all of this down here. It's all below 50 degrees at night. This is when we get to retain acidity during harvest. But this is what happens during the day. So this is August, same graph, same weather station. This is the couple 100-degree days. Look at how fast that temperature drops. I mean, basically at 6 in the afternoon or 7 in the afternoon, it just plummets. By 10 o'clock at night or midnight, we're already down into the high 60s. And basically it cools off the vineyard. So when the sun comes up the next morning, it takes an equivalent amount of time to warm that vineyard back up. And because it starts cool, it can't ever get too hot by the time it's 1 or 2 in the afternoon. This is the biggest difference between elevation vineyards generally, and also because this is a north-facing vineyard. So this gives you an idea of some of those very local topographical questions that we were talking about earlier on. And then again, this is a close-up of harvest. We have nights, in September 30th, it was 35 degrees. Like, we were worried about frost. Nobody worries about frost in Napa in the middle of September or early October. We've gotten bitten by frost more than once. I'll show you a picture of it. So this is basically how the ripening happens. It's a very cool, slow ripening up there at elevation. Basically, fall comes a month earlier up where we are. So if you're up in up Obsidian Ridge in October 1st, it feels like Napa on November 1st. This is the local aspect I'm going to talk about. So this is the top of the bottom of the vineyard, 2340. This is the top of the vineyard, 2650. We actually have almost 3 different vineyards that we pick. The top of the vineyard buds out early because it's in an inversion layer. It gives us, it ripens quite early. This is the top of the vineyard here. The middle part of the vineyard is middle, the Goldilocks section. And then this is very cool, which is basically a month later, and we pick it much lower sugars, and it's much tighter wine and more aromatic. Why is that? Well, at nighttime, when the temperatures are during the day here about the same, look at the difference. The upper part of the vineyard's in the 60s. The lower part of the vineyards is in the high 30s. Do you know how long it takes for that grape to warm up the next morning to even start to ripen? It's probably only 10 or 11 o'clock at night in the morning. So that's why the difference with the top of the vineyard ripens is very full. It gives us those kind of dark black fruit characters, a lot of volume in the wine. The bottom part of the vineyard is this part here, which is quite frankly probably colder than typical Bordeaux. And that's where we're picking at 24, 25 bricks a month later. And that gives us a much more of the aromatics of the wine in Obsidian Ridge. And I think that gives us more verticality of the wine from the top to bottom. I can talk about that in a minute. So the ripening curve. Basically, this is the simple way of doing it. Sugar accumulates more slowly, acids break down more slowly, and that just gives you more time for phenolic maturation and what I call verticality in wine. And we got our super secret graphics department, which is basically me with some Sharpies to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So we talk about primary ripening as basically sugar. Secondary and tertiary ripening are seed tannins, phenolic maturation, color, aroma, all those sorts of things. If you are in a warm region, sugars go up fast, acids break down because at nighttime it's warm, and you have to pick here. Otherwise, you get a totally flabby, high alcohol wine. This is the Central Valley. This is why they can't make wines with phenolic complexity. It's not because they're bad farmers. It's just because of the climate. As you get cooler, you can start moving that dot out. Sugar accumulates less slowly, acids break down less slowly. And this is the whole shooting match, right? This is where all the good stuff happens in terms of grape development. Now, there are three ways you can move this dot. One, you're coast to the ocean, like Sonoma Coast. Two, you're high latitude, like British Columbia or southern Patagonia. Or three, you go up in elevation. So latitude, proximity to the ocean, they all basically have the same, or altitude, is at night times are around 50 degrees or below. And that's the same thing with the fog in our Carneros vineyard. But this is what we dream about as winemakers and as grape growers. And this is where, again, all of the good stuff happens. And this is what allows us to create more complex wines, wines that are already more developed, especially tannin structure and integrated, without being super high alcohol. And by the way, with having pretty good acidity. And that is really the trick of growing Cabernet and Bordeaux varietals for us at that elevation, not just at high elevation, but also on a north-facing slope. But I don't want to make this sound like this is some picnic, because it isn't. I took this picture with the Nokia phone in 2009. This was the final day of harvest, and we had frankly had our ass handed to us. And let me tell you why. At the very top of the vineyard here is super rocky. We had a series of days with almost zero humidity, and we lost almost 20 tons of grapes that just shriveled like raisins. They're the most expensive raisins you can buy in a box. 2 weeks later, we had 5 inches of rain dumped on the vineyard, which is fine because it's so well drained that we just had to wait a couple days and then we could harvest again. And then a week after that, we had 28-degree weather, which you see all this brown stuff. It frosted 30 acres of grapes, just completely. The leaves completely turn into mush. I mean, brittle mush. The grapes are still okay, but harvest is done. You have to pick them very carefully to keep the grapes out of the bin. I mean, this is a we're done here moment. So it does have challenges, but hopefully the wine 2009 tasted great. It's one of our best vintages. But again, mountain viticulture, maybe it's not quite as heroic as a Swiss have it in the northern French, but we have our moments. So anyway, that's our take on Obsidian, and more specifically our take on elevation. And it's a lot of trial and error. I would love to tell you that we were super scientific and thoughtful and found a high vineyard that happened to be north facing, and we were searching for years like the Holy Grail, but we weren't. We found an old abandoned walnut orchard. It looked pretty cool. We did think north facing was a good idea in California because of the heat. A lot of people thought it was a little too high to plant. They thought we'd get frosted out all the time. We got lucky with that inversion layer. So hopefully the wine tastes good as a result. And actually, quite frankly, it's a lot of fun to farm. So, and it's very beautiful. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that made sense. And again, I want to just emphasize that you can find aspects of these factors in many different vineyards, whether it's Spring Mountain, Diamond Mountain, Argentina, wherever. And again, it's not the total elevation that counts. It's the complexity of the landscape around it and the effect that it has on weather, and then specifically where you have your vineyard. Is it north facing? Is it 30-degree slopes? Is it south facing? All that sort of thing. All right, so
thanks, Peter. There's a few questions. Let me just tie it a little bit back to the wine itself. And there's a couple questions on the chat we'll cover. So one of the really important things about mountain viticulture is that the berries end up very small. So not only do the grape skins get thick because of UV and luminosity, but the berries themselves are very small. So you end up getting a very high skin to pulp ratio. As Peter showed, with his hand behind the cluster, it's a very loose cluster, and these are almost like blueberries. So, when you bring a wine to your customer, you pour a wine for someone, you want to see the stuffing in it, right? You want to see that there's complexity and stuffing in it. So there's stuffing in it not only because of the high skin to pulp ratio, but also because we can harvest it later or wait until we have full maturity of the grape phenolically and not just from a sugar perspective. So that's super important. The other important part is that, and I'm sure you've had people tell you this, like, they're like, I don't really drink cab anymore. And a lot of people don't drink cab anymore because it's heavy, right? It's big, it's heavy, it weighs you down. And if you take, if you make it too ripe, that's where you're going to get a lot of that heaviness. And in California, as Peter mentioned, and I'm sure you see this in Florida too, in our lifetime, we have seen these climate changes. So we've seen real effects where if we had planted Obsidian Ridge 40 years ago, we probably wouldn't have gotten the kind of ripeness we could get 20 years ago was when we planted it. So we're in a window now where we get to ripeness and still have that complexity and don't have that extra heavy stuff. And so that elevation gives you kind of acidity and freshness and brightness. And that's the trick. We want to make a Cabernet that is both has great stuffing and has great complexity, but also has freshness. We talk about the bittersweet chocolate, a high-end chocolate versus the Milky Way, right? The high-end chocolate has the structure and tannins in it, but it still has some sweetness to it. And it's got a lot more complexity than your average Milky Way. And so we're making, sort of higher-end chocolate wines because of that set of dynamics. And as Peter said, we learned a lot up there. We didn't know this when we started. We learned a lot along the way. Peter, you want to pick a couple of questions?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the last question first because that helps to answer the first. What I mean about verticality is, so, Phil Spector, Wall of Sound, like Walm, that kind of music style. I mean, some Cabernets are like that. It's just like a wall of fruit. Like it's just monotone. I mean, it's really impressive. It's big. I get it. I think the trick with Cabernet is not only to make Cabernet powerful, but to make it pretty. And the way you make it pretty is that you have a lot of the high tones that are left in the fruit. By high tones, I mean lavender, rose, raspberry, those types of tones that you get when Cabernet is not quite ripe. Now, at the same time, you also get some green out of that. But if you note, there's a real herbal note in Obsidian wines because of the cooler lower sections of that vineyard. And I think it's a really important part of making a vertical wine. If we have some wines that we bottle, which are just from the top, they're big. They have a lot of volume. They kind of hit that hedonistic Cabernet thing that we all know about. I think it's a less interesting wine than the whole vineyard together because the bottom is aromatic, the middle is the Goldilocks kind of good balance, and the top of the vineyard, and I'm reversing this because of where I think of the flavors, are more of the sort of dark fruit, broad, powerful parts of Cabernet that are obviously what Cabernet is really good at. So that's what I mean by verticality. Temperatures. So two things about temperature. Vines bud out when the soil gets to the right temperature. That's what really kicks off the beginning of your season. So that's not ripening, but that's the start of it. What temperature do grapes begin to ripen? Really, they've got to get above 50 degrees. You know, that's when it's like physiologically nothing really moves under 50 degrees. So, but it's not progressive. I mean, you really need to be, we've had weeks where we get a cool pattern come in October, and we have the vineyards at 70 degrees and they don't budge for 4 or 5 days. There's not a single sugar accumulation. So the answer is really, you got to be really above 70 degrees and more into 75 to 80 to really get good ripening. And then the respiration cycle. So this is actually a really interesting topic. Greg Jones has done a lot of work on it. I don't know enough to answer this, but there are differences in CO2 levels as you go into elevation. It's not enough to notice breathing or anything like that, but it does affect grape physiology. It's super hard to measure consistently across different vineyards, and there's not been a lot of formal research on it. So it's inconclusive, but there are definitely questions about respiration cycles, CO2, oxygen uptake, et cetera, that are not determined yet. I will say, because the humidity is so low, we do have a lot of evapotranspiration up there. So we do water, not a ton, but we are pretty precise, especially when we get these extremely low humidity events where it's below 10% humidity for a week at a time.
I'll add one other thing, which is that grapes stop ripening above a certain temperature as well. So if you get up into over 100 degrees and you have these extra days of 104, 105, you just stops ripening. It stops physiologically ripening. And that's the problem you're getting on valley floors. So the grapes at Obsidian Ridge, as you noticed from the graph Peter showed, it got to 101 times the entire season last season. In the valley floor, you're going to get that 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 times sometimes. And you have a problem on the top end in terms of ripening. So you want to stay in that 50 to 95 degree zone, 50 to 98 degree zone. That's sort of where you want to be.
Well, I mean, giving an extreme example of that, I think it was 2017. Napa was at 110 degrees during harvest. You know, basically, the vine never turns back on after that. What happens is that the grape decides that it has to save its life. It closes all the stomata, which is on the backside of the leaf. That's how it breathes and respirates. And that's it. Once that grape shuts down, like at that level, it's very hard for it to start back up and finish ripening. It's a real concern. It's a very real concern in especially northern Napa. So especially
we learned a really interesting thing in 2011. I think that's worth talking about as well, about elevation. On October 2nd, I don't know if you remember this, but you probably remember 2011 wines. The word on the street was stay away from them in Napa, because we had 3 days of a rainstorm. It came in October 1st, 2nd, and it dropped a lot of rain for early October. And so people were making this decision: do we pick now, before the rain, or after the rain? And for the people who waited after the rain, one of the problem was that the storm not only stayed for a couple of days, but the air was stagnant. So it didn't blow through the moisture and humidity. So on the valley floors, there's all this humidity that accumulated, causing conditions that are good for rot and other not good things for grape wine. So people who picked before had sort of green unripe fruit. People who picked afterward could have sort of, you know, off flavors because of some of the mildew issues. We're up at elevation, 3,000 feet. It rained, it dried out there in a minute because those winds came up, and it was a completely different scenario based on sort of local things. And then we had the most amazing ripening. So from October 2nd to November 6th was the last day we picked. Peter probably has a picture, I know. The last day we picked the grapes, a little bit of frost on them. We had this amazing, amazing fall. So to that little graph that Peter drew, we had that physiological time. We could extend the ripening season so that we not only were at ripeness, but we had this amazing maturity. And 2011 was some of the best wines we've made, frankly, and where other parts that were not in the mountains struggled.
I have a question that's a little too much to type in the chat if you don't mind me asking.
Yeah.
If we were to look at say average bricks on ripening in Napa fruit in general over the course of the last say 30 years, I'm guessing we would all agree that like it was typical to pick at a lower bricks rate in say the 70s. We think about like Old Heights Vineyard calves with their olivey characteristics and things like that, and then certainly higher bricks, picking at higher bricks on average as we go into the 90s, et cetera. And I'm wondering how much, in your opinion, of that is just what's in style versus maybe climate change causing that. And I guess maybe my question is, to what degree do you feel like the winemaker can choose how ripe to pick their grapes versus like there really is a specific time that they should be picked, period, if that makes any sense? Thank you.
Carter, 2 weeks ago, our parents celebrated their 54th anniversary, and they opened a bottle of Robert Mondavi 1966, was it? 54? Yeah, that they bought. And in fact, we had grown grapes for Bob Mondavi way back in the days, long story. I looked at, Dad sent me a picture of the label because we're not seeing them because of their age. He's now 93 years old. It was 12.7% alcohol. I was like, holy shit, like, are you serious? Like 12.7? I mean, that's like, Burgundy doesn't even get it. So yes, stylistically, that was a much bigger difference. So in the 1990s, there was a lot of this thing about hang time. I don't know if you guys remember this, but basically they went to Bordeaux and they said, well, they do it like this in Bordeaux. So they slam up the canopy, they take all the leaves off the side of the grapes, and they just let the sun hit it for this kind of secondary, tertiary ripening that we were talking about, right? Well, it beats the shit out of that grape, first of all. I mean, those things look like if you get a heat wave and you have no leaves, I mean, there's a biological reason that we've had leaves for the last X billion years or whatever it is. I mean, it protects fruit, right? So this was, it went to the extreme. It started backing off in the early 2000s, luckily. So yes, there's a lot of this sort of stylistic question. And by the way, these were Cabernets that you could stick your fork in it and it would stand up. I mean, people had never drunk these wines. There was something new about them, and 200% new oak, and it was just a shit show. But anyway, nowadays, the larger problem is, even if people want to pick earlier and have lower alcohol, the alcohols are going up quicker. So going back to my graph, the problem is, even if they pick earlier and have lower alcohol, they don't have enough time to get that phenological ripening. That's where they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place in some sites. Now, what they're doing, it's interesting, Spotswood, Aaron at Spotswood is a friend and a really innovative winemaker. They're doing a lot more, they're leaving a lot more canopy. So canopy respirates, right? It is like an air conditioning unit for their vineyard, for your fruit. So that's what we're doing in Obsidian Ridge. We call it lazy VSP. We have the wires, but we don't put the vines up and leave all that fruit cola exposed. We want to have at least 1 or 2 layers of leaves between the sun and the grapes. They're not a bush, so the light gets in there, but they're doing much more of that in Napa. And then watering. If you water properly and the vine does not feel under stress, then it will continue to respirate and it will cool the fruit zone. And there are actually super cool weather monitors now that you put inside the canopy, and it will measure your inside canopy temperature exactly for this effect. So I hope that answered your question, but those are some of the factors. Now at Obsidian Ridge, as I showed you in those graphs, we just really never low humidity is our Achilles heel, but we can deal with that. But because we're north facing and higher up, we're to some extent insured against some of those extreme events for now.
Peter's comment about the vines or the wines we all have in our cellar from the 90s, right? That hang time concept, or the issue of the hang time concept is it introduced this idea that sweetness is good, right? I mean, for most consumers, they like sugar, fat, salt, right? So the sugar parts of it are very appealing, and commercially that did very well. I'm not going to name brand names over the years that have residual sugar in them, but there are many, right? There are many because it works, right? But we think it's a cheap way to work, right? It's a little bit like, you know, you're watching, like, you binge on TV. You're like, it feels great for the first few hours, but then like next day you're like, that wasn't all that great. And I think that's where the American palate is going, right? And that's why younger people are like, I'm not going to drink those fruit bombs, and I'm not going to drink those big sweet wines, because they're just not, you know, it's kind of like this okay boomer moment. I gotta show you a picture. I'm glad Peter mentioned the Robert Mondavi. Like, let's just say in the time of COVID, I've been like delivering cases of wine to my parents' house. They're 93 and 81, and I have a picture here of that bottle. So that I took a picture, went by my parents' house, and they clearly were digging deep into the cellar. But there's the 1967 Robert Mondavi Cab, 12% by alcohol, right? I mean, it was stunning when I saw that. I'll show you a couple more shots. Peter and Alex Arbela's our winemaker. We're up at Obsidian Ridge. Was it 2 days ago? And that's what it looked like. It was just absolutely gorgeous day, like Simpsons clouds looking over the volcano Mount Konocti. And that is actually the old planting. You can see the vines at the very bottom. Those are about 20-year-old vines at this point. Across the way, right over the sort of little stretch of pine, is the new planting, Eli's Block. And that's just, we had some fruit off that last year.
Can I just mention something before you move forward? To give you guys an idea about elevation and so forth, if you were in Oakville today, those canopies would be 2.5 times as big. So right now, those shoots are about 1 foot long. In Oakville today, they almost look like full canopies, because it basically starts out a month later. You know, I do this all the time. I drive up in April, Napa's green. I get up to Obsidian Ridge, and I'm like bundled up, and it's still basically late winter-ish by California standards.
And here's your first view of 2020 Obsidian Ridge Cabernet, a little cluster clinging to life up at 2,600 feet, you know, overlooking Konocti. It's just gorgeous up there. Honestly, we can't. The Zoom's fine, I guess, for now, but the best thing would be to have you all up there someday, because it's just a stunning place. And you know, we can talk about elevation and oak on a Zoom, but we did a seminar at the top of Obsidian Ridge for a bunch of winemakers maybe like 3 years ago, and it was May, so it was about the same time of year. And all of a sudden, this just ginormous hailstorm just dropped about 2 inches of hail everywhere. And we're like, we don't even have to do the presentation, right? Like, you just look out, and they could tell exactly what mountain farming was and mountain viticulture.
We were doing it in a tent, and it felt like we were stuck in a drum, because it was so goddamn loud. We had to wait for 15 minutes. Anyway.
Yeah. So that's our story, Elise. I don't know if you want to wrap up with anything, but boy, we did it with 2 minutes to spare. But if anyone has questions, again, we really, really appreciate the time. We love talking about this stuff. We love doing it. It's a lot of fun for us, and it's fun to share that knowledge. We hope to change wine in a little bit. Like, we think there's a whole generation of consumers that are not going to do what the boomers did, and we want to be part of that. And we want to pave the way, you know, for kind of a new generation to enjoy wine sort of in nature, with balance, and kind of in a different style.
Thanks all for making the time for us today and last week. And we really look forward to seeing you on the other side of all of this. In person, hopefully. I'm sure that'll happen soon. In the meanwhile, have a great Memorial Day weekend, and be safe as you guys are reopening up your state.
Take care, everybody. Thanks. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.